Reach to Teach is a series of 6 online sessions developed at the George Washington University by Professors Heller, Hoffman, and Torregas under a grant from the Department of Defense. Any use of the material in these slides should acknowledge the university, the authors, the granting agency, and the grant number. Welcome to Session 2, Setting Objectives. As we noted in Session 1, not only will we cover educational aspects, we will also cover more information about community colleges and also the role of ethics and legal issues in teaching. We've already established that there is a national need for cybersecurity and a need for an educated workforce to provide that security. Additionally, community colleges are well positioned to fulfill that need. But community colleges need faculty, and using the cybersecurity professional as adjunct faculty could provide the solution. What's today's session about? It is preparing you to teach as adjunct faculty. We will learn more about community colleges. We will learn about forming objectives for a teaching and learning session, and we will look at the issue of pairing the two. Here are the objectives for today's session. Students will be able to explain the history of community colleges as relates to the movement toward a more educated populace. Students will be able to write objectives in measurable terms. And students will list 3 ethical concerns related to teaching cybersecurity. A tall order. A little bit about the history of community colleges. You might be asking, why are we even looking at this issue? And the reason is because most of you have not attended a community college and probably know very little about them. Community colleges are not a new phenomenon, even though there is a lot of discussion currently about the value and access that community college education has the potential to provide. The roots of community colleges stem way back until the late 1800s. Here's a quote that might give you some understanding about community colleges. Without excluding other scientific and classical studies and keeping the military tactic to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanic arts in such a manner as the legislatures of states may respectively prescribe in order to promote liberal and practical education in the industrial classes in several pursuits and professions in life. Wow, that's a lot. But take it apart and you'll see that this is the point of a community college under the Morrill Act and the land-grant colleges was to provide a liberal and practical education in industry and in professions. And of course, in the late 1800s, as land-grant colleges, that related primarily to agriculture. Research universities, such as the University of Chicago and Johns Hopkins University, in the 1890s, developed what you might think of as the curriculum for a community college or a junior college. William Harper at the University of Chicago felt that the first 2 years of a typical university education could be moved to a less expensive, less time commitment, less travel to campus, and so he created and supported the Joliet Junior College, the first community college in 1901, and that college is still in operation today. So again, there are 3 important items or events in the history of community colleges in the United States. The Morrill Act, which created the land-grant colleges, whose purpose was to provide a lot of education focused in agriculture and in mechanics. The engagement of research universities in the issue, and the establishment of a junior college. So again, the community colleges have their roots in the Morrill Act of 1862, and as championed by William Harper, community colleges were providing the first 2 years of the typical university education while being less expensive, requiring a less time commitment, and with less travel to campuses. In a recent census of community college, it was noted that there are nearly 8 million students enrolled, and less than 50% of these students attend full-time. I thought you might enjoy seeing the images of some of the early and current community colleges. So here's a zoology class in 1901 at the Joliet Community College. And what do you notice about this? The presence of women at higher education, because community colleges were to extend education to other members of the population, and women were rarely represented at higher education in the late 1890s and early 1900s. Here's an image of Johnson Community College, and we include it because this was not limited to Chicago and the North, but all over the country, community colleges were appearing. And finally, an image of Montgomery College, which was called then Montgomery Community College, and it was the first community college in the state of Maryland. There's a wonderful YouTube video on the history of community colleges, and I urge you to take the time to click on the YouTube video link and watch the entire video. When you have finished, you can advance the slide to the next slide. I hope you enjoyed the video on the history of community colleges. But now let's go back and consider our discussion of ethics with a few practical or maybe not so realistic scenarios. What do you think? Professor X has written a book on password protection. In the course that he is now teaching, or she is now teaching, Professor X decided to require the book and assigns reading from the book. There's only one copy of the book in the library, and it's nowhere to be found. Do you see any issues here? Have you thought about the fact that since there's only one available book at the community college, and it's in the library, and no one can find it, that students would then be required to purchase the book? Might be an expensive book. Now, it's true that Professor X is an expert, and experts are worth listening to, but not having any books available to students is a problem. Where could you learn about your institution's policies? Where might you go? You might go to the dean's office. You might go to your mentor. You might even do a Google search of your community college to find their policies. So look at the scenario. What change might you suggest to Professor X? Right now, Professor X has written a book and has decided to require the book and assign readings and presumably homework from the book. What change might you suggest? Did you think that you might suggest to Professor X that copies of the book be purchased and put in the library? Should Professor X go to the chairman of the department and ask that a copy of the book be made available, and made available on reserve so that it is always available for the other students? I'd be interested in knowing your other suggestions. Let's change the scenario just a bit. Professor X has written a book on password protection. In the course, Professor X requires the book and assigns reading and maybe homework from the book. Students were told to bring their credit card to class to buy the book. Oh, what issues do you see here? Have you thought about the look of requiring students to pay for the book in front of the faculty member? The security of their credit card? The pressure to buy the book? Where would you go to learn the policies of your institutions, and what changes would you make? Let's make one more change to this scenario. Professor X has created a DVD on password protection with images and study examples. Students can't receive the DVD without payment. You see, it sounds simple, but then there are lots of layers to be worried about. What changes, if any, would you suggest here? Remember that Professor X has a lot of intellectual property in the creation of that DVD. Should he be required to give it away? That's where ethics becomes an issue for discussion. If ethical concerns were interesting to you, you might want to go down this list and think about them. What are some of the major ethical issues currently confronting faculty and community colleges today? What guidance exists? What formal guidelines exist? And what research gaps exist regarding ethics and the teaching of community colleges, and how those gaps could be eliminated? And now we've come to the core of this session, how and why to establish learning objectives. Here's Bianca Paulo from Leawood Community College in Hawaii. She has some comments on objectives. Once you've listened to her comments and watched the video, you can advance to the next slide.
The first time you get in there, they tell you, you gotta teach, and you wonder, teach what? What am I gonna teach? Now, when I was a teaching assistant, they just told me help with the homework. When I was an instructor or an adjunct, they told me, oh, just follow the book. And I was like, what book? Can you tell me which book you're using now? And somebody thankfully gave me a book. But when you get a book this thick, you absolutely have no idea what you're going to be teaching. So try to get a book in advance if possible, right? Now, another thing is, or look at the topics, say, I would like, look around at the industry and say, okay, this is what they need. Let me look at the topics that actually cover something that is going to be useful for the student. Nowadays, we have learning outcomes. And so if you go and look at your learning outcomes and try to find a book that explains those topics in a way that kind of matches, because I was just thrown out there and said, go teach. And then I found a book, and I was given a book, and that was about everything that I had to go. Okay. One piece of advice is do some classroom observation. If you know of somebody that is teaching the same class that you're going to be teaching, ask, hey, can I go sit there? Can I watch you? Maybe it's been a while since you have been a student, maybe it hasn't. But I'm pretty sure that if it's been just a little bit since you were a student, you know exactly the kind of stuff that you think, and you're like, if I were a teacher, I wouldn't do that. Ooh, that's a good idea. If I were explaining that, I would explain it that way. So be a student in order to be a better teacher.
So, objectives. Would you get into a car without a plan on where you're going? I was going to say never, but it's certainly rarely. Well, a teaching or learning experience also requires planning. And objectives help to organize your thinking about what you're presenting and what you expect the students to be able to do based on this information. And the word do is important, and you'll see why. Let's take a few minutes to review this video on learning objectives. As you look at the video, think about a lesson you might want to present on creating computer passwords. Click on the link, watch the video. You might want to expand the video to full screen. When you've finished watching the video, come back to this slide and then advance the slide. So creating objectives, you might want to think about CABD. The condition, what are the issues? The actor, who is it? The behavior you expect the actor to accomplish, and the degree to which you want them to accomplish it. So, what do you think your objective might be for your lesson on passwords? Did you think of something like this? After this lecture or this session, my students will know good passwords. Let's see if that expression of objectives will help you know if you have been effective in delivering the material. Let's see if this objective will help you plan the lesson itself. Again, after this lecture or lesson, my students will know good passwords. Let's see how good an objective that really is. So think about condition, actor, behavior, degree. Have we actually identified what has happened that you want to check? What condition has occurred? Have you... So after my lesson, a little bit, who are you checking? My students. the actors, my students. The behavior. What do you expect them to do? The current objective says my students will know about good passwords. How will you know if they know? Can you see knowing? Can you observe knowing? Can you look inside their brains to see if they know? What could you do better? What could you observe? Could you observe their writing good passwords, listing good passwords, identifying good passwords from a list? How many? What degree? How many passwords? Do you mean that they'd be able to write 1 or 10 or even more? So you see what seems like an okay objective. After this lecture, my students will know about good passwords. Really will be very hard for you to use that to plan your lecture and to measure how effective your lecture was. So let's rewrite it. How about after this lecture or lesson, my students will be able to list 5 features of a good password. Reasonable. Now you'll be able to see if they can do it. And if they can't list 5, that might say to you, I better look back in my lesson and see if I made clear what 5 features exist for good passwords. Maybe I only made sure that I listed 3. So not only do objectives help you organize a lecture or a lesson, help you understand how the students are progressing, but also serve to come back and help you evaluate how well you have prepared your lesson. So creating objectives. Different objectives focus on different skills. And here's a list of increasing skills that could form your objectives. Recognizing a strong password is perhaps the, quote, easiest of all of the skill levels to recognize. So you might have an objective that lists 5 or 6 passwords and asks the students to circle or mark or check those from the list that are strong. Recognize. A more advanced skill concerning passwords would be to be able to create or write a strong password. A skill that requires even deeper understanding would be that you want students to be able to distinguish between good and poor passwords and why. Moving up in the skill ladder, if you will, students might discuss the rules behind creating strong passwords and whether they believe that there's a need for those rules or that other rules might apply. Especially today, as we move to biometrics instead of passwords, that might be a very lively discussion. At the top of the skill level, which is sort of a policy discussion, maybe your students would discuss why the U.S. government no longer urges people to take a favorite phrase and replace it with keyboard characters as something that was at one time suggested. So you can see that different objectives focus on different skills, and we want our students to have those different skills. So, creating the objectives and the teaching learning experience, pairing the two. Once you have a good objective, after this lesson, my students will be able to list 5 features of a good password. Now you can go back to your plan. Have you covered 5? Have you presented examples of poorly written passwords? Have you provided reasons and so on? So you now can use that to establish your lesson and evaluate your lesson. Objectives are a roadmap for a session as well as an entire course. They help you select material, organize your presentations, add interesting and effective learning activities, prepare assignments, and evaluate your students' progress as well as your own. I want to say a word about homework because homework is often a way of evaluating or expressing an objective. Grading homework and tests, the grading is a faculty responsibility, and returning those grades in a timely manner is very important because that feedback will correct students' misunderstanding. Rebecca Shanley is a student who has some interesting comments about feedback. Once you've listened to Rebecca, you can advance the slide.
I think that receiving grades back in a somewhat timely manner is a really important thing that a lot of the professors I've had in the past wound up not taking as seriously as I wanted them to. I was in a class first semester where I didn't know my grades until 2 days after I took my final, which led to a lot of miscommunication amongst not just me, but my other classmates about how we thought we were doing in the class versus how we actually did. And I feel like that just created more issues on the part of the professor, on the part of the students, than if we had just had some sort of constant, not even constant, just like maybe during midterms, if he had posted his grades then we would have been able to have a mid-semester like evaluation of ourselves and be able to change things before it's too late. We never had that opportunity to go back and change anything, which in contrast to a teacher I also had first semester who posted things, I would say every 2 weeks we would have all of our grades posted, which is more frequent than I would even ideal. That was amazing, and I couldn't expect that from everybody because of just workload and stuff, but I really appreciated it when I was able to very easily track how I was doing in the class.
And now there is homework for you. Your next topic in your network security class is about the network stack. I'd like you to write 3 different objectives. Remember to use action verbs. Write 1 objective that requires your students to remember a specific detail. Write 1 objective that requires students to apply what they know about a stack. And write 1 objective that requires students to solve a network stack problem. And a quick question about assessment. What's the difference between formative and summative assessment? Formative assessment is the kind of assessment you would use, like measuring your objectives, to fine-tune the lesson, where summative assessment is more like a final exam. And here are some references to follow up.